Okay, well, I guess first off, happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day.
Happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day. It's every May 20th for those in the audience. We did an event at Overit, our first one on accessibility 2 years ago. Last year, we would have liked to do one, but COVID threw us all a wrench in the works, so we were unfortunately not able to. But we're doing something this year, and we'll probably do something moving forward. This is the 10th anniversary of the inaugural Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which again is a day dedicated to promoting and fostering accessibility, not just digital accessibility. Accessibility also means kind of like physical accessibility on roadways and public spaces, but in particular, we really emphasize today, especially as a marketing agency, digital or web accessibility. So thanks for help put this together, Michelle, and thank you everyone who's joined us today for this informative hour. I hope you guys get something out of it.
Yeah, my pleasure. I think this is something that we're all really passionate about at Overit, and I believe everyone probably knows who Overit is by joining this panel, but we are a full service marketing agency and are very passionate about accessibility. It's something we pride ourselves in all our web builds, and we're excited to be here to talk about it. My name is Michelle Dinsmore. I am one of the principals of Overit.
And I am Dan O'Leary. I'm a senior digital strategist at Overit. So I think our agenda is up on the screen. So, we advertise it as 7 things you need to know. So what are the 7 things that we want to cover today? Really high level, like what is web accessibility and Global Accessibility Awareness Day? I think we covered the second, but we'll kind of dig in a little bit more at a high level for the first. We're definitely going to talk about ADA, the American with Disabilities Act. It's probably the major reason or number one reason why people have signed up today, because they're worried or unsure of like, what's my legal compliance required? What's the risks associated with this? So we're going to talk about ADA, some recent legislation that's hit Congress's floor, and some of the relevant court rulings, particularly in the federal district courts. That have impacted web accessibility. We're definitely going to talk WCAG 2.0 to 2.2 standards. Those are the web content accessibility guidelines that are effectively kind of like the gold standard for setting web accessibility standards. The WCAG standards are built on 4 basic principles of accessibility. And I hope today the major takeaway is like, if you can understand what these 4 principles are and what they're trying to achieve, you're going to have a good understanding of accessibility, be able to explain it and champion it at your organization or business. We'll talk briefly about website accessibility plans and statements of accessibility. These are things organizations can start doing even today, even this webinar, as actionable steps to start improving and integrating accessibility into your organization's website and digital strategies. We definitely will try to touch upon tools and plugins. It's often a common question people have. I heard about this tool or this plugin solution. What do you think? What do you recommend? So we'll talk about those with the word of caution. And then again, as we wrap up, I want to give some actionable like next steps and ideas for like what can you do on Global Accessibility Day and the 364 other days of the year where this is a lived experience for millions of people. So obviously it's very important today, but as Michelle says, we really emphasize it at Overit, and it's a 365 kind of day thing. So all right, we get started.
Yeah, what an aggressive agenda here, Dan. Let's dive in.
Yeah, let's dive in because we're already trying to move forward here. All right, so what is web accessibility? I'm going to describe it as like the confluence of 4 things, right? It's 1, a set of legal expectations. So for some stakeholders, they're going to think of web accessibility as like something I have to do or that is the law expects me to fulfill. It's also depending, on what stakeholder. If you're like a designer or a web designer, it's a inclusive design philosophy. Inclusive means that it supports all audiences and that there's no barriers based on any disabilities or impairments. Yeah. It's a set of best practices for web developers. So typically, you know, developers work off of designs that designers may have put together for a website. So not only is it a design philosophy, but from a web development standpoint, it's a set of best practices. And that's really what the WCAG standards dive into. What are the best practices and outcomes that web developers should be solving and coding for? And then in my mind, again, it's a basic component now of like risk management. Just like user information security is like non-negotiable, right? Cybersecurity is non-negotiable. I would argue that we should start perceiving and viewing web accessibility as sort of one of those things. It's fundamentally to be like baked into something that you're committed to organizationally, that you invest in, and that you understand that there's certain obligations. They will incur resources, whether that's time or money, but those obligations are not necessarily going to go away, right? So it's a basic part of risk management. And I would also mention that, you know, it's the I in DEI. We have a lot of clients, and in the workplace today, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives are being championed all across this country, which is a fantastic thing. You know, inclusion, we just talked about inclusive design. Accessibility is a component of inclusion. So I know for a fact that many disability rights advocates would say we've been at the forefront of initiatives for decades. And that crosses all racial and gender, you know, spectrums, of course, right? So we've got, you know, what's the law expect of you? It's a way to design for everybody. It's a way to code your websites or develop your websites. And then again, from a business or organizational standpoint, it's basic risk management and DEI. Let's talk ADA. So the American with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, but there are precursors that speak to the rights of disabled individuals much earlier than that. The most significant one is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. That's a law that in 2 years will be 50 years old. It's going to hit its 50th anniversary. And the relevant sections that most people would be familiar with would be sections 504 and 508. 508 compliance pertains to federal websites. So those were the first websites that definitely were held to the strictest standard, even under interpretations before ADA. In 1973, the government basically said, the federal government said that when we're communicating with our citizens, we will make sure that regardless of your disability, you will be able to receive those communications from us. So this is the first time that you would even see something like the government required broadcasters to provide closed captioning services on their broadcast, right? That didn't start until the mid-70s because of the Rehabilitation Act. You fast forward to 1990 and you have the ADA, and the Rehabilitation Act only really explicitly referred to the federal government. It didn't refer to state governments or local governments, and it definitely like the private sector. But what the American Disabilities Act, specifically Title III, did is it opened up and said that people with disabilities have rights to access to all public accommodation. So that phrase, public accommodation, it's a legal term. It's a little slippery and nebulous depending on which court is interpreting it, right? But it extends in beyond just the government to the public sphere and can include, and has been interpreted many times in the past, to include private businesses, right? If you have a brick and mortar store, if you're public facing, if you're engaging with the public, your website can be interpreted as a public accommodation. In New York State, I know we've got a lot of people who are from New York State, right? The state level equivalent for Section 508 is New York State P08005. It's again a requirement that all websites that New York State government builds or maintains or partners with agencies, that they have a level of accessibility that's very similar to what the 508 requirements require. And if we have any viewers who, you know, you have business or clients or users who are overseas, in EU, they have the Web Accessibility Directive. That right now only pertains to the actual public sector. So it's mainly those governments that make up the EU. In Canada, it's for, they have a very similar one. It's just called the Web Accessibility Guidelines or something like that. It also pertains only to the public sector, right? Many parts of the world have no accessibility guidelines, unfortunately. So I know for many third world or developing parts of the country that are becoming first world, they're still very behind on this. You know, getting even internet access is a big deal. Never mind making sure that websites are fully accessible. So I know many of you who are watching are now asking like, well, what about the private sector, right?
Absolutely.
Is our business or organization something that should really be worrying about this? Well, again, Title III covers all public accommodations. And that's an elusive term, as I mentioned, for the web. Like, is a website a public accommodation? I can tell you that prior federal rulings in many federal districts, several, have already upheld that websites and apps are covered under the ADA. The ADA was written in 1990. It doesn't even mention the World Wide Web because it didn't exist until like the mid to late 90s, right? Tim Berners-Lee created WWW around, I think, 96, 97, 98, sometimes maybe a little bit earlier. But the ADA doesn't explicitly even mention websites, never mind apps, something that no one could even imagine. But the courts have ruled that under the spirit of the law, that they believe that websites and apps are public accommodations. So we've seen over the last 5 years, you know, I really started getting interested in this topic around 2016 when I saw news coverage on the number of lawsuits that were Title III lawsuits in federal courts by plaintiffs who were suing website owners, and not just like, well, they're a state or even a nonprofit, like private businesses, corporations, small businesses, businesses of all sizes. And there was double to triple digit growth for like 5 consecutive years in regards to like how many more lawsuits were there the next year. And we know that New York has led the pack almost every year. So again, this is why we're so sensitive to it at Overit, because we have so many clients, including New York State agencies and nonprofits that, you know, are, I would say, you're at the highest risk vector or area because New York has always led the way. We're in District 2 for federal courts, and they are more permissive and have a more liberal interpretation of the ADA when it comes to website accessibility. Other states that have led the pack behind, you know, New York are Florida, California, Texas has had some. Many other states are starting to see them as well. We've had in the 11th district, though, which is down in the southeast, that includes Florida, all right? That's probably the main state to think of. They recently had a appeal that was, they overturned the previous ruling. The case was called Gill versus Winn-Dixie, and the plaintiff was a blind gentleman who wanted to use the Winn-Dixie website. If you're not familiar, Winn-Dixie is a popular grocery chain down in the South. So Winn-Dixie had a website. And the plaintiff wanted to upload coupons, manufacturer coupons, to his account and get the discounts when he went into the register. And he wanted to, because he used the pharmacy there, he wanted to like refill his prescriptions through the website. Now, the website was not accessible, and really under the, you know, in the eyes of the court, that was never really in question. I think Winn-Dixie's legal team even admitted that. In 2 seconds? 1 second.
Yeah, no problem.
5 minutes? Can they wait till after 12 o'clock? Or I'm sorry, after 1 o'clock. This will be over at 1. We're having a webinar. I'm like live on the internet. All right. I'm being told that they need to set the fire alarms off here. I'm trying to delay them.
Wow.
I have to, I will run outside, but
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Bear with me.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens. So sorry, I want to go back a little bit. So in the Winn-Dixie case, oops, I need to go back. In the Winn-Dixie case, what we had here was the website was not able to fulfill those functions, and they basically said it's not intended to. You can't buy groceries through the Winn-Dixie website. So because it was not intended to actually be like an e-commerce thing, it was purely just for like information or sales or promotion information, I'm assuming, the judge ruled that it did not actually qualify as a public accommodation. Had Winn-Dixie actually allowed the sale of groceries, like many places now, you can like order your groceries, any e-retailer like Walmart, Target, where their website is just the same, they would be held to those standards. But in this case, because Winn-Dixie was not actually selling groceries, they like basically like repealed the ruling. So Florida was a state where there was a lot of aggressive filings because of some peculiarities about the damages. They have a very high number of damages. They don't cap damages in these court proceedings. So for what we would used to call like drive-by lawsuits, these were very profitable places to file them. So we'll probably see a drop in filings in Florida, but the 9th district, which is still out in California, the 2nd district in New York, they're still upholding very liberal interpretations of ADA to cover websites and apps for anybody that, again, is interacting or engaging with the public. If you're selling with a shopping cart, you're probably covered under ADA. If you are accepting, like, you know, you use your website for lead generation, I want your email or contact information for some longer sale, or again, maybe you're just an organization, a nonprofit, and you just want to get people to join. You're probably, again, covered under ADA. So in my opinion, this is probably going to go to the Supreme Court at some point. The 9th, 11th, 2nd Federal District Court of Appeals, they're all one step below the Supreme Court. There are some districts, such as the 1st District, which covers Massachusetts and Maine and New England. It's never even heard a web accessibility case. So you have a lot of districts that hear them, you have some that are overturning, and then you have some that don't even hear them. So you know, as I read the tea leaves, what's my belief? I believe by 2030, probably at the latest, we will have a definitive ruling that comes through the Supreme Court that basically is all across the country, a definitive interpretation of the ADA, right? Go ahead.
No, that's really interesting. Interesting times. I mean, yeah. I wonder even how Florida, you know, specifically might have changed just in the past couple of years, let alone the whole landscape.
And we've also had, you know, all of that's in the courts. I could tell you also a little bit what's happening in Congress. There's been a few over the years, I would say over the last 15 years, there's been 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of a bill that people have tried to sponsor that would basically be a little bit more clear and spell out real regulations and explicit standards. Like, what standards should we be using? ADA doesn't mention WCAG. Again, it doesn't even mention the web, right? So there was a bipartisan bill. It's called the Online Accessibility Act. They tried to pass this in 2020. They tried to pass it again in 2021. It's had bipartisan support. There's a guy, Bud, and a guy, Carrera. They're congressmen. One's a Democrat from California. One's a Republican from North Carolina. They tried to foster this bill, and in some regards, it would explicitly mention the WCAG 2.0 standards. It would give any website owner that was hit with a lawsuit 90 days to remediate it, and then the court might dismiss the lawsuit as if they, in good faith, tried to address it. So it had bipartisan support. Unfortunately, what it has not had, it doesn't have the support of disability rights advocates. While disability rights advocates have been very happy with explicitly pointing to WCAG as a standard, they did not like other parts of the bill, including the limiting of civil actions, the timelines by which someone could sue, and then again, like caps on damages, right? So until the bipartisan support in Congress gets the support of the disability rights community, I'm not sure even where congressional bills are going to go. So again, we may see something in Congress that circumvents the need to go to the Supreme Court. If we don't see something from Congress within the next 5 to 10 years, we may just go to the Supreme Court on this.
Dan, is that what that bill was called, the Online Disability?
It was called the Online Accessibility Act, OAA, okay. And there's been a couple different versions of it. So you have to look up like which year was that bill. Because again, they tried to pass it in 2020. It didn't pass. They amended some of the language. They tried to, the same sponsors put it up again in 2021. And this was just voted on, I think, a couple of weeks ago, a couple months ago, and it was shot down again. It did not pass. So I expect that the sponsors, again, will try to work with the disability rights community and see if they can find some kind of compromise. But as for now, you know, it doesn't look good. So we're back to the drawing board. All right, so that's a little bit of the ADA and the legal frameworks. So let's dive into WCAG standards, right? So WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are standards that are created and maintained by the W3C consortium, which is basically they're the people who are the backbone of the World Wide Web. They set the standards for how the internet works. And they have a working group within that larger organization called the WAI, the Web Accessibility Initiative. All these people partner together and they create and foster and promote and then publish these standards. No law that I'm aware of yet explicitly mentions WCAG as the standard, right? Not the Rehabilitation Act, not the ADA. The Online Accessibility Act would have, but it did not pass. But most courts, when these ADA Title III lawsuits have gone to court, the courts have consistently recognized WCAG 2.0 AA conformity as acceptable remediative efforts to address the core principles of core concerns of the lawsuit, right? So the courts don't explicitly refer to it, but they defer to these standards, right? And I can tell you, you will not find better technical standards to adopt anyway. These are the gold standards for website accessibility. So the first WCAG were in 1999. Fast forward a decade, we have version 2.0. Version 2.1 came out 2018. So right after we did our, right before we did our first webinar on this topic. And you can see that the WCAG 2.2 standards are slated for 2021. So we're now updating them faster because the technology is coming faster. 10 years is like a lifetime in the life cycle of the web, right? 10 years ago, no one was using smartphones, no one was using apps, hardly anyone, not as many people, right? And again, if you had a website, it was just a website, not necessarily an app, right? WCAG standards cover all of the web. Anything that could be considered like a digital communication technology is going to be covered under WCAG. So 2.2 should release this year. It was slated for May or June, but COVID again bumped it back, but I expect it to be released Q3 or Q4 of 2021. WCAG themselves has not said anything differently. If you're confused by the versioning, all you need to know is that they're backwards compatible. So if you are WCAG 2.2 compliant, you are 2.1 compliant, and you are 2.0 compliant. For the most part, if you're 2.0 compliant, you're also 2.1 compliant. There's a very few exceptions, but it's always the W3C group always recommends, if possible, have your developers look at the most recent up-to-date standards because they'll always, whatever the court points to, because the court may not say 2.2, they may say 2.0. Well, if you build or develop to 2.2, you're in full compliance with 2.0. That's how these are designed, right? So what do the WCAG standards entail? Well, they're organized around 4 basic principles, all right? And each of those principles have 3 to 4 specific guidelines that further elucidate what is trying to be achieved. They're very outcome driven. And for each guideline, there are specific success criteria that you can check. These are essentially pass-fail tests, okay? And depending on which criteria you meet, you can reach A, AA, or AAA level of conformity. Single A is the lowest level of conformity. It's like a minimally viable, accessible website. AA is considered really good, and AAA is the highest level of conformity. Some standards do not even have AAA levels or criteria, so they only max out at AA anyway. Most court cases have said A to AA is what you need to do. So if you're asking, do I need AAA level conformity? Probably not. AA is probably sufficient. In many cases, A may be sufficient. But again, it's best to shoot for the best standards, right? The most up to date. Try to reach AAA level of conformity. And if you can't, you may still reach AA or single A level of conformity. So the 4 guidelines, and again, these are, if you take away anything, please let it be these, right? Web content and your navigation, how users use your website, the interfaces. They have to be perceivable to all audiences, regardless of disability. They have to be operable. they have to be understandable, and they have to be robust. And robust has a specific meaning here, meaning like how it works with other technologies. So I want to go through each of these in turn. The acronym is POUR, P-O-U-R, right? Perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So what do each of these mean? Well, they're covering three main types of disabilities, all right? I'm not going to try to lump all disabilities into the same bucket, but you have, I would say, three broad types. There are people who have sensory impairments or disabilities. You may have those who have motor or kinesthetic, it's sometimes called, disabilities. And then you have people who have cognitive or neurological disabilities, right? Another thing I want to stress is that disabilities and impairments exist on a spectrum, okay? For some people, these are very pervasive, lifelong conditions that impact their lived experience. For some people, these impairments may come and go. And for other people, they may be temporary. 2 years ago, my son broke his arm, and he had to use his computer and all of his little electronic devices without the use of his right arm, which was his dominant arm. So that was a very eye-opening experience for me at the time, even as a father, because he was already at that point kind of addicted to his tablets and such, but he had a hard time using them, right? So don't think of disability as well, you have it or you don't. It's not a light switch, it's a dimmer switch, right? And people may experience how bad that impairment is impacting their ability to access the web on varying degrees, depending on the day, depending on the website, okay? But perceivable, let's start there. Web content and navigations have to be perceivable. The two main impairments you need to be looking out for are visual impairments, so people who are fully blind or who may have colorblindness or visual acuity issues. This could include senior citizens, people with bad eyesight, people who can't see things that are low contrast. We're going to talk about color contrast in a bit, right? But it's not just fully blind people, it's anyone who has a little bit of difficulty kind of seeing the content on the page. It could be an auditory impairment. If you're showing video that has an audio track along with it, or you're doing a podcast, right? If a person's deaf or they have auditory impairments, hearing aids, they may also have special needs, captioning or transcripts. So I know that we've turned on the captioning. If you're viewing, you should be able to see captions at the bottom for the Zoom conference, right? So this is an example of a assistive technology that we can use to make content more accessible to those who cannot, through their ability, their sensory abilities, normally not engage with that content. So we always want to provide at least one alternative method of whatever you're showing. Multimedia in particular needs to be addressed in that regard, because if you can't see, how do I know what a picture or a video is? If I cannot hear, how do I know what you're saying? So we need to provide alternative ways for that information to be conveyed through the website. Then there's Operable. So Operable is how you're interacting with the website or completing on-site actions. Again, if I'm buying something from a website, I need to navigate the shopping cart experience. If you're a lead generation site, you probably have calls to action and eventually forms or fields that you want people to fill out. Their ability to interact with your website is what we mean by operable. Some people, again, have visual impairments. They cannot necessarily see what you're asking them to do. So screen readers need to be able to identify what those calls to actions are or those on-site actions. Or they may have motor impairments. They may not be able to use a mouse. They may have no hands or arms. Many people have tremor, senior citizens in particular, or anybody who has a tremor symptom as a part of another type of condition. So their ability to hover their mouse over a specific point and click on a field may not be the same as someone else. So all websites should be operable without use of a mouse. Keyboard operation is one good check or test. Go to your website, hit tab, and start hitting the tab key and see, do you see a little focus bar that kind of highlights or circles around the links on your website? That's what you should be seeing. It's called an area of focus. If you don't see an area of focus from a quick tab, that's almost an immediate sign. All right, your website's not typically operable unless you're using the mouse. And then of course, there's many things like sliders, accordions, click open tab, view more. There's lots of things that web designers and developers use this day to like pack websites full of content without necessarily crowding the screen right away, right? So we ask the user to like click and engage to get the rest of the content to be presented to them. So we need that to be, again, functional in more than one way. Cannot be just through a mouse, cannot just be through a keyboard. Has to also be with if you're requiring voice activated screen reader technologies, and some people have such impairments that they may need to vocalize all requests to their screen readers to click on things, right? So they have to work with assistive technologies as well. Understandable typically covers cognitive impairments. This could be slight to full mental retardation. This could be someone who has ADHD or exists somewhere on that spectrum, okay? Asperger's. It could also just cover, again, I would say, always think about the audience that you're trying to reach. And if you're trying to reach a mass audience, you shouldn't have content written at like advanced levels, right? Only PhD content should be written at a PhD level. For most audiences, you should be aiming to write your content at like a 10th grade level. And think about organization. It cannot just be a large mass of text. That's a string of text, and there's no spaces, there's no paragraph breaks, there's no headings, all right? So as a designer or developer, if you have content that's approaching 300 to 500 words, you should already be thinking about heading tags that break up the flow of the content. And these are things that people can visually pick up on to sort of guide them through the content. And also it's things that assistive technologies and screen readers can pick up on. So audiences can also dive into the part of the content that's most relevant to them. It helps them navigate if you clearly organize your content well through headings, all right? And then the last part is robust. Your websites have to support, not hinder, a wide range of assistive technologies that exist and that could exist, or user agents, as we would call them. Like when Google crawls your site, we call it a user agent. But from a technical standpoint, when a screen reader crawls your website, you know, there's a really popular one called JAWS, J-A-W-S. It's probably, I won't say the top one, but it's one of the most widely used screen readers. It downloads and crawls your website very similar to the way Google bot would. It just does things differently with what it downloads than with what Google does. Google adds it to their server database. JAWS then attempts to read it to you and gives you choices to interact with the website. So I have seen in some cases, even in good attempts to try to make a website accessible, what it sometimes does is it hinders or blocks those user agents. So you always want to make sure that your websites are kind of tested before you fully are confident that they're accessible, that they're tested by audiences and users who actually use assistive technology. We're going to talk about like live user testing versus using tools to check. You know, they need to complement each other. You always are going to need an actual user to tell you, can I access this website, see all the content. So what are some common issues we might be solving for? These by no means are all of the issues that your website may experience or have to address, but these are, in my experience, Overit's experience, the most common things that you can quickly kind of look and ask and figure out, do we do that, all right? So one, text has to be encoded as HTML text. I see sometimes on websites, they put text in pictures, like they used a graphic design tool to create a PNG or JPEG image and put text into it. Now you and I, Michelle, we can read that and it might be useful to us. But again, a screen reader just sees picture and it might say image1.png. It's not useful to a user, right? So we want to make sure that if you're putting text on a screen, that you're properly encoding it as text. Audio and video, they always need transcripts or captioning. You know, there's a variety of solutions out there for that. Some of it are done internally, some of it are done third party, some of it can be done through an API or an integrated technology stack solution, to use a bunch of buzzwords. But you know, contact us if you have any questions or you're curious about that. We can find a good solution for you based on your needs and your budget. Again, can your website be navigated via a keyboard or assistive tech? Do not assume that a mouse alone is sufficient. So all the things that you normally click on with your website, I encourage you to try to use tab and enter. Enter would be the equivalent key on a keyboard to click, right? So you should be able to navigate with the tab key through your links and enter to go to the next page or to open up a section of content that was there. Can any on-site actions be completed with the mouse, without a mouse? So can I stop a slider? Can I restart a slider? Can I stop or pause the video? Can I give you my email? Can I check out through a shopping cart and give you my credit card and go through all the process for e-com? All of those things, again, would fall under operable. Colorblindness. If you have primarily males, I would say, or like if your audience skews male, please understand 15% of men are colorblind. Red green is the most common one. So like if you have like a lifestyle brand and it's like geared towards young men and you have like red or green in your logos, like you may want to reconsider that. But there's many different types of color blindness. Again, red green's just the most common one that I think most people are familiar with, but there are other ones. There are tools that will let you quickly check and like let you see what your website would look like if you had that type of color blindness. So there are some pretty cool tools and plugins that kind of simulate not just red-green color blindness, but other types of color blindness. So depending on your web design, what may seem very clear and good contrast to you is gray to somebody else, okay? Even if they don't have color blindness, there could be color contrast issues. This again is what I would refer to as visual acuity. Some people have like fields, like white bars, and then the background is like maybe a soft off cream white, right? Well, to enter the field, especially let's think if you're a senior citizen, they have to figure out where the background ends and where the field starts. And if the contrast is not sufficient enough, and I believe the WCAG recommendations are the color contrast should be 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 even in terms of like dark to light, okay? Many of you have maybe turned on like nighttime mode on your phones. Have you ever seen that? Or like alternative contrast. It's a different experience looking at your phone or on the web when you go to those alternative contrast modes. But they're again supposed to like reduce strain on the eyes. So look at your color contrast, your text size. If you have audiences over 40, you need to have sufficient text size, and you need to have your website be such that if someone increases the text size manually through their browser, it doesn't significantly distort the layout of the page. Again, I believe the standard is that they should be able to magnify up to 300% without significant degradation of the layout of the website, okay? So if you're using responsive design, things typically tile or resize accordingly, but you need to check for that. I mentioned the space between your fields. Again, besides the contrast between your fields in the background, if you have a 6-field form, name, email, company, phone number, occupation, well, the space between those fields, especially if you're trying to use it through a mouse, if I can't quite distinguish between where one starts and one ends because my hand is tremoring, that's an issue. So there needs to be significant pixel space. I believe at least 2 to 3 pixels needs to be the kind of ribbon in between fields to make sure that there's sufficient space between them. Sliders need to be able to be paused and should not be set to like auto, that you can't turn it off, all right? People who have ADHD in particular, this affects them. And also people who have motion or flashing sensitivities. People who have like epileptic symptoms or straight epileptic seizures from lots of motion or flashing, okay? So I know like Web 2.0 websites, it used to be like, let's have fireworks just shooting out at the user, and it's at 120 hertz, meaning very, very fast, that it's flickering. Can't do that. I don't have the specific hertz that you can max out at, but it's fairly low, all right? So no flickering, no flashing. Anything that's moving or animating needs to be able to be paused or stopped with user control. Content clarity and organization. Again, once you reach a couple hundred words, use paragraph breaks, use good white spacing, use double spacing between your text anyway. These are all just good design philosophies, but they're also part of accessibility. And then again, think of clear, good paragraph heading to break up content, break things into sections as needed. Maybe even consider providing what are called the jump or anchor links, where you can click on a link and get dropped right to that section. I know sometimes FAQs, when a website might have like 100 FAQs, you can click and it'll drop you right to that answer, right? So we've all experienced probably like what we would call a jump link, where it just drops you to a specific part of the page. If you have such long form content, consider using those, because they make content more understandable and accessible to audiences. And then again, you have to play nice with assistive technologies. Do not actively block or hinder them. Make sure that before you are, telling your users or internally we're 100% ADA compliant, that you simulated with real assistive technologies a couple of typical on-site actions. Most websites, you're not trying to do everything, right? You're either e-com or you're lead gen or you're this or that. So you have a good grasp on, on the home page, we try to get them to do this. And on this or that page, we're trying to get them to do this. You probably, I would say, have 3 to 5 major on-site actions and then maybe a few secondary ones. We'll start with the most obvious. What's the thing you're trying to accomplish or foster the most, right? What are the things most likely that the user is going to do? And check through an assistive technology such as JAWS or any other reader, or pay a vendor to do that, right? There are audits where, again, some of the companies that's what they'll do. If you don't have actual users who can tell you that internally or in your audience, you can always outsource that, and they will make sure, if they're a qualified, reputable vendor, that they can do that, and that they will make sure that those are being tested by real live users in the wild, as we would say. All right, so we covered ADA, we covered WCAG. Now I know it's like, Michelle, this is something you were really passionate about. Like, we've got to cover next steps, right? Mm-hmm. What are next steps? So one thing I'm going to recommend is that if you don't have in your organization or company a website accessibility plan, now's best day of the year to start getting organized and thinking about that and promoting that internally in your organization. So the first thing I would recommend is like, well, how do you put together a website accessibility plan? One is you got to get organized, okay? Do your research. Again, after this, we will be sending out a document of resources to all the participants of the webinar. So if you didn't catch something, you didn't write it down, believe me, everything we covered and more is going to be sent to you, within 24 hours in a document. But I encourage you, Google WCAG, go to that website and look over the standards and the guidelines. Again, I covered at a high level the 4 principles because I think it's the most clear to laymen. Like, if you understand this, you kind of get the gist of what you're trying to accomplish. But the guidelines themselves are a little bit more specific, and the success criteria are going to be the most meaningful to an actual web developer, right? So go to the website, or just again read really basic FAQs. If this still seems Greek to you when you're done after this webinar, do your research. There's no shortage of blog posts that covers at a real high level for lay, non-technical, non-legal audiences what you need to do and how to do it. All right. Form an internal team. I always recommend do not try to go this alone. So you may be the sole participant in this webinar from your organization, but find at least one other person, if not 2 or more, to partner or team up with so that you can champion this. Because in my experience, this type of thing, it's often perceived as it's a headache. It's a resource and money suck. There's no ROI in it. Why are we doing this? You need to champion it, and you need to champion it beyond just well, we're covering our butts, right? It's more than just risk mitigation. It's also, I've never seen a fully accessible website that didn't have great user experience. My background actually is in SEO. Digital accessibility is a passion of mine, but it's a recent one I've added to my skill set. I started as an SEO, but I've never seen a fully accessible website that wasn't SEO friendly, because if you can make it clear to assistive readers, you can make it clear to Google, right? So good accessibility is good user experience. You get better conversion rates. You get better experiences across the board. So this just kind of needs to be translated from legal and web development jargon to hey, we're improving our site for a variety of reasons, and we're going to do it this way. Who would be good members of your internal team? If you have already in your organization a legal department or a lawyer, right? Someone who looks over already contracts, other statements of compliance on your website, right? Even if it's a lawyer on retainer, let them know, hey, I just attended a WCAG ADA webinar. It's not something we've done. Do you know anything about it? Are you familiar with ADA? Most lawyers, again, are, even if they're not experts, they go to law school to like train and learn how to research the case law. So the relevant case law is like all there, right? If they're your business's or organization's lawyer, they need to get familiar with like website accessibility. So I would say any legal or risk mitigation person, that's a person you would want. I would say one executive, get a CEO, get a CTO if you have it, CMO, whoever, you can get that's like, a little bit higher up in the organizational totem pole. That's a good one. And then I will say it's always a good idea to get a tech stakeholder, because when rubber meets road, you will need someone who actually understands from a technical standpoint the actual standard, right? And inevitably that reaches like a web developer or someone who's maintaining your website. You may be maintaining it internally. You may have outsourced that to an agency or to another vendor. You need to get in contact with them though and say, ADA and WCAG compliance is important to us. Are you familiar with it? And they should definitely be familiar with it, and they should be kind of pointing to themselves a WCAG standard. So if you have a web host or agency or developer or anybody who's like currently in charge of your website, and you ask them about ADA or WCAG and they just stare at you, that's a good litmus test of you may want to find another vendor, or you need to tell them, hey, you've got a lot of homework to do because we're going to be moving forward in this. So form a team. I would say document everything. Do keep a paper trail. All right. I can say that it's not a fail-safe, but when organizations demonstrate that they know what accessibility is, that they've made good faith efforts internally to like try to improve their accessibility, when you can, like, if you are, God forbid, ever given a legal summons or a subpoena that you have to go to court and address this, you have documentation you could provide to the court that may give you a little bit more relief, all right, or a little bit more good faith that you've tried to remediate it. Because again, certain legislation that hasn't passed is trying to give people as a default 90 days. Some courts have just gone ahead and done that and say you've got 90 days to address it and we'll revisit it. Others are like, you don't have 90 days. You need to address this like yesterday, okay? So I would say always a good paper trail inside, documented through email, all right? Any internal conversations, try to recap it through a formal notes that you put into somewhere and that it's stored somewhere. The general plan though is find a vendor or organization that can audit your website if you have real dire concerns, all right? If you have no clue where to start, get an audit done, okay? Tire kicking. Off of the audit, you will be able to assess and determine how pervasive or bad are any known accessibility issues, and like what's the amount of resources or timeline going to be to address that. Any reputable vendor who can like audit your website should also give you a good indicator of like how hard or difficult is it to solve for this, right? And they'll tell you these are ticky-tack things that should only take you a few hours, or this is going to require an extensive redesign or relaunch. And like, in a staging environment, build out a new website that's a superior version of your current website, okay? So you audit, you assess, then you implement. Again, you may have your own web developers, you may have your own IT department. They're the ones who are going to implement that. If not, you don't need to work with the same people that did the audit. You may not want to, but you'll need to find a vendor or web developer who can implement WCAG-based recommendations, right? And then you want to review annually or biannually. I know when we work with New York State websites, we've built them out and they've been New York State compliant. The rules are every 2 years, even after we build them out, we're required to check and recertify every 2 years that the websites are still fully accessible. Okay?
Dan, with 2.2 coming out, how does this, impact this you know, exercise. And
if you refer, good question. If you refer to the 2.1 standards now, again, 2.0 was, I would say, 98% compliant with 2.1. It wasn't just backwards compatible, it's largely forward compatible as well. So I wouldn't say don't freak out, oh, I don't know what the 2.2 standards are yet. Like, it doesn't matter. Get your devs to start looking at even just a 2.0, a 2.1 standards, because when 2.2 comes out, it's only going to be like a few specific things that have been tweaked. And again, it's more to support and better be clear on technologies that are not necessarily web pages, right?
Right.
Apps, other, you know, augmented reality, VR, assistive technologies, things we don't even consider assistive technologies like digital assistants. If you're using Alexa or Siri, right? So the 2.2 standards just slightly broaden and make sure that they clear and encompass, and that they provide not just the expectation, but the how. That's the thing. WCAG has always been based off of outcomes. We expect it to be blah, 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 but it hasn't always been in previous standard versions. It hasn't always been so explicit, or like, do this, or this is how you do this, okay? I will say also WCAG standards are written such that it gives developers flexibility, creativity, and nuance. They don't micromanage. There's always more than one way to solve for this. If your developer is like, I don't know how to do it, I'll just say, like, go to Stack Overflow, go to GitHub.
Right.
I guarantee you will find documentation on how to do this. And maybe you don't feel comfortable, or, you know, it hurts your pride to copy and paste some code over, but like, be open source best practices for a reason. The accessibility community makes almost everything open source because we want to share it, right? So even from a technology standpoint, IT, the resources are there, okay? So I want to stress again, accessibility is a process. It's something that you do annually, you recheck, you commit to doing it, you follow up on it, and it's a process more than just like check, 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 right? It's more than just a checklist, it's a process. So statements of accessibility. These are one of the first things that you can do on your website, even before you make it fully accessible. A statement of accessibility basically says, hey, we're aware of what accessibility is. Here's our commitment to it. Here's our promise to you as a user. And it typically provides contact information for, like, if you are having any issues using, perceiving, operating, understanding our website, contact this, email or call us. There should typically be at least 2 methods of contact, right? And it gives people specific feedback mechanisms that they can tell you, you know, what their experience was. So statement of accessibility is kind of like, it's a little bit of legalese boilerplate. You may put it in your global footer. You may put it in your global header. You can put it in your menu. I mean, people place it in different things, but it should be highly visible all throughout the site. All right, so it's going to be a site-wide link typically. And again, it states, here's our promise to you. If you have any issues, contact X, Y, or Z. And then someone actually needs to receive that. Again, probably someone that's a member of the stakeholder team, and they need to respond back to that person in a timely manner and give actual next steps. Here's what we're going to do based on your feedback, and give them timelines. If you have statements of accessibility and you actually do that organizationally, I am not a lawyer. I cannot tell you what would happen in court. I can't tell you that you won't get a legal summons. What I can tell you is that you're going to be in a much better place, and that if you do have to hire counsel, that they will be much happier with the current context than if you do nothing, okay? A statement of accessibility, again, you can Google one, find one really boilerplate, swap out company name, whatever you need. These are fairly boilerplate documents that you can template and then modify for your organizational needs as you see fit. But I'd recommend that be one of the first things that you do as your website accessibility plan. All right, I know we only have a few minutes left. I think we've got like 3 to 5 minutes left. So I just want to cover tools and vendors. So tools, if you use Chrome or Safari, there are plugins and extensions that are specifically designed to help you check page by page. Like, is your website, is this page that we're on accessible, okay? So you can go through your website, starting with the home page and going through your major pages, and use like a plugin or an extension where you click it kind of in your Chrome top bar. I use Chrome a lot. And it just runs an automated check, and it tells you contrast is low, the spacing isn't enough, whatever issues it might run into. I will tell you though that automated checks can only cover at most 40, maybe these days 50% of the checks that you need to actually do to stay in full confidence we're fully WCAG compliant. So if anybody is trying to tell you, oh, you can just use tools for that, they're not fully informed or they've been misinformed, okay? It's a good start. I use tools every day. Again, I have 3 different tools that do this for me. I will say if you're looking for, well, what kind of tool should I get? Look for anything that mentions AXE. AXE or the AXE framework is like a technology backbone that, one, it's a tool itself. You can just get the straight AXE plugin, but it lets web developers and web development teams like ours at Overit, you can use the AXE framework to create your own internal in-house tools. So any marketing or design agency or web developer, like you should start testing your own products and builds, and you can use AXE to create your own tools. If the user interface or how it works isn't to your liking, these are open source API driven frameworks that let you create your own tools. And there's a no shortage of community out there that have already created tools. Some of them might be $1.99 in the marketplace. Some of them are fully free, okay? So go find a tool or plugin and do some basic checks. Website plugins or overlays. You may have gone to a website and like in the bottom left, you click on something and it's like, do you want to change the color contrast? Do you want to make the text bigger? I will say be careful. Some of those overlays and technology solutions, one, there's a cottage industries of people promoting or hawking those and saying that you'll be fully ADA compliant. That is not the case. I won't say they're snake oil salesmen, but they're not giving you the full truth there, okay? They're viable, I would say, as a short-term stopgap solution. They're a Band-Aid. If you have no immediate IT or web development resources, I would say for maybe a period of 90, 120 days, it's better than nothing, but it's always better to actually solve for the core coding issues. Most of those overlays, what they'll do is they'll just, they don't change the underlying source code. They just act as an intermediary between the server that is hosting the website and your browser. So they're not really addressing the core problem, okay? And in some cases, again, they can actively hinder or block the very assistive technologies you're supposed to be assisting, right? Let assistive technologies do their job because they're built, custom built for that purpose. And then again, vendors. Contact Michelle at Overit if there's any questions or concerns at the end of the webinar. But even if you don't go with Overit, find, do your due diligence. Find a vendor that is well recommended and that'll at least always give you one case or website that they did for an audit or for an accessible build, and contact that group or organization and ask them. Anybody who's not going to share at least one case study or client with you is probably not someone that you want to like work with. Ask specifically about the WCAG standards, and that vendor should know them back and forth, be able to tell you just as confidently and clearly as I talked about them today, if not more so, okay? And then what you'll probably have to decide is, do you want to just go with an audit and you're going to get information about here's things that we found, red flags that you'll need to address, but you're going to try to address them on your own or find another vendor to do it? Or do you want a vendor that can not only audit your website, but fully implement your website, fully implement the recommendations as well? I would say some vendors specialize in one, some specialize in both. Some prefer to actually do the remediation, but don't necessarily like to do the audits. Ask, the account managers and service reps will be a good idea of like what their forte is, okay? And some of them actually, as a rule of, what's the word I'm looking for? Conflict of interest. Some vendors will only do audits. Right. They don't want to implement because they want to give you confidence that when I'm telling you, I'm not just doing it so I can bill you to do it, right? So I'm not just going to create tire spinning exercises and tell you because you don't know any better that you need to spend all this money on stuff. So you don't need to split it. If a vendor likes to do both, I'm not saying that you shouldn't contract that way, but if a vendor's like, I only like to do audits, there's a reason for that. And that should also give you confidence in mind. Final thoughts. Again, web accessibility, it isn't just risk management. This is the lived experience for hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers, millions of Americans and over 1 billion people globally that have some level of impairment or disability, okay? 10% of the world has something that might impact their experience to see your website. 1 out of 10. Would you, if you ran a brick and mortar, just put up a wall that stopped 1 out of 10 people? You wouldn't, right? So come from a place of empathy, not just risk management. Again, I would say if you're solving for web accessibility, you will always improve your website. Your user experience will improve. Your conversion rate should improve. Your SEO should improve, because the saying in the community is what works for all, right? Sounds, you know, a little stupid, but it's very deep. What works for all works for all. And I can promise you, long-term, the ROI is there. Internally, this is, well, we don't have money for it. We didn't budget for it. This is just a legal suck. This is a drive-by lawsuits. This is extortion. I can't tell you the good faith of a plaintiff. What I can tell you is that if you start getting ahead of this now, whether or not you ever go to court, you will have a better website and you will have a better digital strategy. And you may not be able to immediately attribute it back to what you did for web accessibility, but long-term, 3, 5, 7 years down the road, any improvements you make for web accessibility are going to improve your overall web experience, okay? It's 1:04 already. I hope that we didn't boot a bunch of people already. If there's any questions or concerns after this, contact Michelle at overit.com. And again, I know we're going to be sending out a handy resource doc that's a list of links and again, kind of FAQs and a whole bunch of other goodies that are going to get sent out to all the webinar participants. That's going to recap everything we covered. And then again, a few more specific recommendations and ideas and resources that we didn't even get to today.
We do, I think we will have a couple questions and such that maybe we can answer. I see Nika mentioned tests for accessibility.
Yeah, so Nika asked, what tools do you use to test accessibility? I use ANDI. So great question. I use a variety of tools. One, again, as I mentioned, when I'm on any particular website, I do use Chrome plugins and extensions. I use one, again, the main AXE one that's provided by DayQ. DEQUE, by the way, DayQ is probably one of the best vendors out there they're the ones who created the ACTS framework. So they've basically given away great technology to the entire world, but they are also a vendor in their own right that does audits and compliance remediation. But I use that. And then I also have a variety of site crawling tools that I use as well. I use Screaming Frog. I use SiteBulb is my new favorite crawling tool. And then I know another one that I don't personally use, but some of our clients have used is SiteImprove. I've seen SiteImprove reports. I've been given logins to the dashboards. So while I don't use it, I've interacted with it. And SiteImprove also is really well known in the accessibility community as a good, for again, those 40 to 50% of those checks, they're a very good dashboard and infrastructure for like checking, monitoring, and checking your progress. As you solve for it, do the automated checks get better? Where? How quickly? So if you're really into project management and timelines and getting things done in like very specific workflow sequences, a solution like that, SiteImprove, might be something that you'd consider. And they're very cost effective for what they solve for. They have a variety of subscription and plans that you can use for. So those are a couple of tools that I use internally. I'm not familiar with ANDI. I will try to look at that right after the call and see if there's any thumbs up or thumbs down that I can give in that regard.
Awesome. All right, well, I guess we should wrap this up since we're 7 minutes over. Thanks everyone for attending, and sounds like we'll be in touch with awesome presentations and information.
I hope everybody after this clicks off, and if there's anyone at your workplace to talk to or chat to or email to, tell them today's Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and starting tomorrow, if you don't have one in your organization or business, start coming up with the website accessibility plan. Again, if you need some help, let us know. We're always here to help.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Signing
We'll talk
off.
to you soon. Signing off. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.